21 hours. That is how long the most significant diplomatic meeting between the United States and Iran since the revolution that reshaped the Middle East lasted. At 6:30 in the morning, in a hotel lobby in Islamabad, the American vice president walked up to a microphone looking exhausted and visibly drawn, according to the journalists assembled in the room, and ended the entire process in 3 brief sentences. He stated that the talks had produced substantive discussions. He stated that no agreement had been reached, and then he said something that communicated more about the state of the world than any formal communique could have. He said bluntly that this outcome was bad news for Iran, far more than it was bad news for the United States of America. That sentence was not the language of diplomacy. It was not the careful, neutral phrasing designed to keep doors ajar. It was a warning, delivered publicly and with the weight of the office behind it. And what followed from Washington in the hours after the vice president boarded the aircraft to leave Pakistan was not a return to the negotiating table or a plea for further dialogue. It was the announcement of a naval blockade. A statement posted online by the former president declared that the United States would begin a full maritime blockade of Iran, and further asserted that American forces had already started clearing the Strait of Hormuz through the application of force. The ceasefire, which had been fragile and fraught from its inception, is effectively over. The question is no longer whether the next phase of this conflict begins. The question is what form that phase will take, how long it will endure, and who will ultimately pay the highest price. And the answer to that final question is already becoming distressingly clear. The talks in Islamabad were not vague. They did not fail due to a lack of chemistry or a simple misunderstanding in translation. They collapsed on 2 very specific and utterly immovable points of contention. Understanding those 2 points explains precisely why the next phase of this war is going to be significantly more dangerous and unpredictable than anything that has occurred so far. The first sticking point concerned Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium. According to detailed reporting from international broadcasters and regional news agencies, the American demand was not simply about shuttering nuclear facilities. Many of those installations had already sustained significant damage during the preceding 12 days of active conflict. The demand was specifically about the existing inventory of material. Approximately 460 kilograms of highly enriched uranium remained stored deep inside and beneath Iranian nuclear sites that American strikes had previously targeted. The position from Washington was unambiguous and non-negotiable. That material must leave Iranian soil. The destination did not necessarily matter. It could be sent to Russia, it could be consigned to a neutral third country, or it could be relocated anywhere outside of the jurisdiction of Tehran. But it could not remain inside Iran, where it could theoretically be reconstituted into a weapons program the moment political conditions shifted or international attention waned. The Iranian position was equally unambiguous in its refusal. The delegation arrived in Islamabad with the image of the supreme leader visibly displayed on the badge of the lead negotiator. That was not a coincidence or a simple expression of national pride. It was a deliberate, calculated message to everyone seated across the table. The man negotiating the deal was publicly signaling, before a single substantive word had been spoken, that he possessed absolutely no authority to make the one concession that the United States needed most. The second sticking point was the Strait of Hormuz itself, and this issue is arguably more consequential for the economies of Europe and Asia than the nuclear question, as critical as that may be. The Iranian proposal was straightforward but extraordinary in its implications. They suggested opening the strait, but demanded that the United States formally recognize Iranian sovereignty over the waterway. They sought to have the world's most critical oil passage legally and officially registered as Iranian-controlled territory, with Tehran holding veto power over who transits and under what specific conditions. The United States rejected this proposal immediately and without hesitation, because the moment you accept that framing, you have effectively handed Tehran a permanent economic weapon that costs nothing to deploy and generates immense geopolitical leverage every single hour it remains in place. 2 demands, 2 emphatic refusals, and 21 hours of conversation circling around those immovable objects with no resolution whatsoever. But the collapse of these talks did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred against a backdrop of military and logistical activity on both sides that strongly suggests neither delegation arrived in Islamabad with a genuine intention to close a deal. One of the most revealing details of the entire process came from a question posed to the American Vice President during his press conference, and more importantly, from the way he answered it. A reporter asked whether he had consulted with the former president during the course of the negotiations. He confirmed that he had. The reporter pressed further, asking how many times those consultations had taken place. The vice president paused, and according to multiple media outlets, stated that he could not remember the exact number, but that it was somewhere between 6 and 12 times over the span of a single 21-hour session. Consider what that frequency of communication reveals about the structure of authority. This was not a negotiating team that arrived with a clear mandate and the autonomy to close a deal. This was a team that was required to call back to Washington repeatedly over the course of a single day of talks to check what it was allowed to offer and where the red lines were being redrawn in real time. European press reports described the scene with particular clarity, noting that the American side appeared to be operating under the assumption that after more than a month of sustained warfare, Iran would arrive at the table prepared to surrender. Instead, Tehran arrived feeling that it had, in its own strategic framing, successfully survived the onslaught of the most powerful military on the planet. That is not a psychological state that produces easy or swift concessions. Analysts had predicted this dynamic earlier in the week, noting the vice president's lack of prior negotiating experience at this level, and warning that having the head of state hovering over every decision via telephone is a poor substitute for a properly structured and empowered negotiating authority. When both sides are simultaneously claiming victory on the battlefield, and neither possesses the domestic political room to give ground on the issues that actually matter, 21 hours is not a negotiation. It is an extremely expensive and public confirmation that both sides remain far apart. And here is the detail that makes everything that followed even more alarming. While those 21 hours of talks were taking place, both sides were engaged in entirely different activities behind the scenes. The 4-day ceasefire that preceded the Islamabad talks was presented publicly as a genuine pause, a moment of restraint that created space for diplomacy to flourish. The reality on the ground told a starkly different story. On the American side, heavy-lift transport aircraft continued their flight patterns between the continental United States and Europe throughout the ceasefire period, with onward movements detected toward staging areas in the Middle East. Additional transport flights were also tracked moving ground force elements from European bases. According to analysts monitoring the movements, these were not routine logistics resupply flights. They represented the repositioning of combat-capable ground units. The United States was using the ceasefire not to de-escalate, but to move the specific pieces of the chessboard that would be required for whatever comes next. Iran, meanwhile, was doing something equally calculated. According to intelligence reporting cited in regional media, Iran spent the 4-day pause relocating air defense units, specifically moving them toward western Iran and into positions facing the Arabian Gulf. This is a highly specific and revealing repositioning. You do not move sophisticated air defense assets toward the Gulf if you are planning to honor a ceasefire agreement. You move them there if you are preparing to contest American aerial operations over that body of water. And then there is the matter of the tunnel systems. Previous reporting had indicated that during active American strikes on Iran's underground nuclear and missile facilities, the targeting strategy focused on entrances and exits, collapsing the access points to these buried installations rather than attempting to destroy the facilities themselves through thousands of feet of solid rock. Iran's response, both before and during the ceasefire, was to begin re-excavating those access points as rapidly as humanly possible. Getting those tunnels functional again was, and likely still is, a higher priority for the Revolutionary Guard than any diplomatic outcome in Islamabad. Both sides used the pause in active combat to prepare for the resumption of war. But the most alarming intelligence development of the entire ceasefire period was not about troop movements or tunnel repairs. It was about what a major Eastern power was reportedly trying to send to Iran, and what American intelligence intercepted before it could arrive. Reports emerged citing intelligence assessments that a major Asian nation had been preparing to deliver a shipment of man-portable air defense systems, specifically shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, to Iran. The delivery was reportedly being routed through multiple intermediary countries in an effort to obscure the origin of the shipment. Man-portable air defense systems, for those unfamiliar with the term, are exactly what they sound like. They are weapons small and light enough for a single soldier to carry and fire against low-flying aircraft, against helicopters, and against reconnaissance drones. They proved to be a significant factor in past conflicts ranging from the mountains of Afghanistan to the plains of Ukraine. And in the context of the Strait of Hormuz, where American aircraft would be operating at lower altitudes to support mine-clearing operations and convoy escort missions, they represent a very real and immediate threat to pilots and air crews. The embassy of the nation in question denied the report entirely, issuing a statement that it had not provided weapons to any party in the conflict. However, the intelligence assessment had already been shared with allied governments, and the timing of a potential weapon shipment during a declared ceasefire, routed covertly through third countries, fits a broader pattern that analysts and European governments have been tracking throughout this entire conflict. It suggests that external actors are providing strategic support to Iran, not through direct military engagement, but through capability transfers designed to extend the conflict's duration and increase its cost for the West. The significance of this cannot be overstated, particularly for European audiences. Every week this conflict extends. Every week the Strait of Hormuz stays restricted. Every week tankers sit idle at anchor outside the waterway. The economic damage to Europe compounds. And if external actors are actively working to sustain Iran's military capability precisely to keep that pressure on, then the crisis Europe is experiencing is not merely a side effect of a Middle Eastern war. It is a feature of a larger strategic competition. To understand what naval forces are now attempting to do in the Strait of Hormuz, it is necessary to understand the three categories of sea mines that Iran deployed, because each one presents a unique challenge and demands a different and specific response. The first type is the bottom mine. This device sits on the seabed and remains entirely dormant until a metallic hull passes above it at close range. The mine's magnetic sensor detects the metal content of the ship, calculates proximity, and detonates. Against a standard commercial tanker or a naval vessel, the damage is catastrophic. Bottom mines are notoriously difficult to detect from the surface, and extremely difficult to detect from the air. The second type is the moored mine. This device is suspended below the surface at a set depth, anchored to the bottom by a cable. These are invisible from above and difficult to identify by sonar in the complex acoustic environment of a shallow, busy strait. The challenge with moored mines is drift. Current and tide can shift their position over time, meaning the charts Iran drew when deploying them are already unreliable. Officials confirmed to major news outlets that Iran acknowledged its own mine maps were inaccurate precisely because the mines were deployed rapidly and without systematic tracking. Some were simply dropped from small boats into the water at random intervals. The third type is the floating mine, visible at the surface but small and low profile enough to be missed by watch crews, especially at night or in poor visibility. These move with current and tide, creating a roaming threat that is unpredictable in its movement and potentially located far from its original deployment point. Against all three, the primary tool is the minesweeper, a specialized vessel built specifically to locate and neutralize sea mines. And here is where strategic planning over the last decade created a problem that is now very much in play. The 4 Avenger-class minesweepers that had been stationed in Bahrain, which represented the primary mine countermeasure assets in the Gulf region, were decommissioned and removed from service earlier in the decade. Their replacements exist, but in limited numbers, and with an operational record that the Navy itself has described as still maturing. The former president has publicly stated that the United States will clear the strait. He has referenced sending minesweepers. What is actually available are destroyers configured to perform some mine countermeasure functions. 2 such ships transited the strait recently and destroyed an Iranian surveillance drone in the process. These destroyers can clear a specific lane. They cannot clear the entire strait. And clearing a lane is not the same as declaring the waterway safe for unrestricted commerce. With the talks collapsed and the announcement of a blockade made public, the trajectory of the next phase is becoming clearer, even if the specific details remain uncertain. The plan, as pieced together from various financial and news reports, involves 3 distinct elements. First, force clearing a navigable lane through Hormuz by neutralizing mines along a specific corridor. Second, deploying naval escorts, including destroyers and potentially carrier-based air cover, to protect commercial tankers transiting that specific lane. Third, maintaining a sufficient aerial presence to deter Iranian attempts to target vessels in transit. What this plan does not involve, at least in its initial form, is a ground operation. And the reason for that restraint is critically important. A ground component, landing forces on Iranian coastal territory to physically deny Iran access to the strait shoreline, would immediately escalate the conflict into something qualitatively different from what has occurred so far. Once boots are on Iranian soil, the political logic of withdrawal becomes almost impossible to manage. You capture territory, you have to hold territory, you have to defend territory, and suddenly what started as a maritime operation has become an open-ended occupation. The political calendar in Washington does not accommodate an open-ended occupation, so the naval blockade, combined with the mine-clearing lane operation and sustained air patrols, is the option that is most consistent with the stated desire to resolve this conflict quickly while maintaining maximum pressure on Tehran's economy. But Iran, for its part, has already stated through its state-affiliated news agencies that there will be no round of negotiations, and Iran still holds thousands of missiles. Every credible military intelligence assessment that has emerged from this conflict has confirmed that Iran's missile capability remains substantial, despite the damage absorbed over more than a month of strikes. A naval blockade will be contested. The question is the scale of that contest and who else gets pulled into it. While Washington and Tehran were trading blame for the collapse of the Islamabad talks, something significant happened in the Arabian Peninsula that received almost no attention in Western media, and that development arguably matters as much as anything that occurred in Pakistan. A major Gulf kingdom announced the arrival of advanced fighter aircraft from a South Asian nuclear power on its sovereign territory. Along with the aircraft came Army infantry units and critically air defense systems. Let us be precise about why this is so significant. The South Asian nation in question was the country hosting these peace talks. It presented itself throughout this process as a neutral mediator, a trusted interlocutor that both sides could work through. And now, within days of those talks collapsing, it is deploying combat aircraft and ground troops to defend a Gulf monarchy. That is not the behavior of a neutral mediator. That is a country picking a side. For the Gulf states, this military contribution represents something they have been searching for since the beginning of this conflict. A capable partner that is not the United States of America. The wealthy monarchies of the Gulf have learned a painful lesson over the past several weeks. The American security umbrella they had built their entire defense architecture around did not fully protect their oil infrastructure from Iranian strikes. It did not prevent attacks on their pipelines, their tanker fleets, or their gas liquefaction facilities. The Gulf states are now operating from the assumption that the next phase of this conflict will be even more destructive than the last, and that they cannot afford to enter it relying solely on American protection. Financial reports from London have detailed the arms procurement race that has accelerated across the Gulf during this conflict. Nations in East Asia and Europe have sold more air defense systems to Gulf states in the past 6 weeks than in the preceding 6 years combined. European defense contractors have delivered batteries at emergency pricing, with Gulf buyers paying multiples of standard contract value because they needed delivery immediately, and manufacturers understood the leverage that created. There are reports that one Gulf state which holds a mutual defense agreement with a large South Asian republic may be considering activating that agreement to bring additional military assets into the picture. The Gulf states are not abandoning the United States. They have no viable alternative at the strategic level. But what this conflict has revealed is that the Gulf security model of total dependence on a single American security guarantee is finished. It proved insufficient, and every Gulf government that watched drones and missiles strike their infrastructure while American forces were focused on different objectives has drawn the same conclusion. Diversify or remain permanently vulnerable. Here is the clearest possible picture of where things stand as of this moment. The United States is preparing to force open the Strait of Hormuz. 2 destroyers have already gone in, cleared a drone, and come back out. This was a deliberate demonstration that naval power can operate in the mined waterway. A broader mine-clearing operation is being assembled. Naval escorts for commercial traffic are being organized. A blockade of Iranian maritime activity has been publicly committed to. Iran has thousands of missiles, reconstituted air defense positions, and a government that has just told its own population it won the talks by refusing American demands. A supreme leader who cannot appear in public is not in a position to sign a compromise agreement even if he wanted to, and the hardline factions surrounding him have every incentive to ensure no such agreement materializes. The Gulf states are bleeding economically. The critical pipeline that allows crude to bypass Hormuz entirely, was struck and remains non-operational. A major gas producer cannot export its primary resource. Neighboring nations cannot move their oil. Every day the strait stays closed or restricted. The Gulf economies absorb damage that is more severe than anything they modeled in their pre-war planning. European airports are still counting their jet fuel reserves in weeks, not months. Asian allies are still exploring alternative energy conversations with Moscow and Beijing. And in Washington, the administration that came into this conflict without a clear endgame is now choosing between a naval blockade that will be contested by a still capable Iranian military, a ground operation that the political situation cannot sustain, or a diplomatic track that Iran just publicly declared it has no interest in resuming. That is not a menu of good options. It is a menu of costly ones, and the bill, as it always does in Middle Eastern conflicts, is being paid most heavily by the people who live closest to the violence and had the least say in how it started. 21 hours, 12 phone calls to the executive residence, 2 demands that neither side would move on, and a press conference at dawn in a Pakistani hotel where the Vice President of the United States told the world the deal was dead. He said this was bad news for Iran, and in a narrow military sense he may be right, because what comes next, a forced reopening of Hormuz, a potential blockade, and sustained pressure on what remains of Iran's economy, will be painful for Tehran. But a lasting solution requires something that none of the parties currently possess: the domestic political space to accept a compromise that looks like a concession. The American side cannot accept a deal that leaves Iran's nuclear program intact. Iran cannot accept a deal that removes its uranium stockpile, and neither side can accept the other's definition of who controls the world's most critical waterway. The gap that could not be bridged in 21 hours in Islamabad does not close simply because the setting changes. It closes when one side runs out of options entirely, or when the cost of continuing becomes higher than the cost of yielding. The situation is not there yet, but it is closer than it has ever been. The next several days are going to move very fast.